Just a reminder that this is the week you've all been waiting for. The discussion groups will begin. Yay! And we can explore this week the flood story in all of its interesting detail and try to see if it makes sense for us to divide it into two different literary sources, and if so, what the plus and minuses are from that exercise. So we will be experimenting with that, and so it would be a really good idea for you to read the flood story. You ought to be there by this time, and the lectures will get to it today. So we are semi on schedule. The furniture demons apparently visited us over the weekend and moved chairs around so that there are not, everybody is a lot more group-oriented today. So if you want to spread out some, there are other chairs up here hiding in the corner that you can take, and there are a few left over here too that are empty, but you have to march up through the crowd to get to them. All right, last time we were looking at the Yahwist's take on the early life of the world, and we were looking at the creation story and particularly what happens in the garden. And it is not a pleasant story. At the very beginning, we saw the people transgressed the clear command of the deity, which is not going to make the deity very happy. And so we were just at that crucial point, and we were already anticipating what has happened and what is about to happen. Namely, the ability of the creation to operate as a single unified space is about to break up. And the people who apparently originally got along with each other are now separated from each other. And that separation is reflected, as we noticed, in the conversations that they have with each other. They originally apparently got along as a group. Now they will begin to separate, and they will no longer be the congenial creation which God apparently originally intended. Not only that, their action in disobeying the command of the deity will have a dramatic effect on the rest of creation. What they do is not without result and influence elsewhere in the creation. If you think this is a modern idea, you are about to discover that it is not. In the last conversation, the two humans have been busily blaming each other for this turn of events. And finally, they turn to the creation itself, namely the serpent, and blame the serpent for all of this. God apparently accepts that particular blame and then immediately responds to the serpent. So we pick up the story in chapter 3, verse 14. And God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more," it's not more than the rest of the creation, which would imply that the rest of the creation is cursed. It is not, at least not yet. That's coming, but not yet. It's cursed away from the rest. That is to say, the serpent now becomes a separate category in the creation and has characteristics which people will regret, just as they should have regretted listening to what the serpent said to them. You are cursed away from all of the other animals, and on your belly you shall go. Apparently the serpent used to walk around on 4 legs like other animals. And we already know that it talked. If the serpent hadn't talked, then life would have been a lot different for everybody. But the serpent now becomes something resembling the serpents that you all know and love. So you will go on your belly, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So we have a dramatic example of the way in which human activity has caused a separation within the created order itself. And to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. This is the beginning of sex-linked activity in our text. So it starts at the very beginning, and all of this is seen by the Yahwist as part of the brokenness of creation. It is not the way God originally intended this to be. And at this point in the narrative for the Yahwist, the warped web of male-female relationships begins. No longer are they bone of bone and flesh of flesh as they were originally created. Now there is a rupture between the two of them. Love and sex bring pleasure in life, but also pain. Love creates desire, but may result in domination, which perverts love and shows its demonic side. Love and hate, joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, equality and domination. Just as the serpent had predicted, they now have both kinds of knowledge, good and evil. The kind of mixture that is the human condition as we know it has now begun. And to Adam, or to the man, is a better translation, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree, which I commanded you not to eat, cursed is the ground because of you. This is quite explicit now, the way that human action brings a curse on the ground. People's actions are not simply benign, and they are not simply associated with themselves, but they can lead to consequences in the entire created order, including the inanimate ground from which life was originally taken. If you are looking for places where biblical concern for the environment begins, here it is, at the very start of the relationship between humans and the rest of the world. It's not the case that the Yahwist doesn't know about this or care about it. It is in that category of things which are things that God did not intend to happen. The ground is cursed because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you. You shall eat the plants of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So the life, as the Yahwist now portrays it as a result of this activity, is this wearisome circle. which the writer of Ecclesiastes will complain about later on. There is nothing new. Everything goes around. It comes back to where it began, and so does human life. People began as dust, created from the ground, and they will return to dust, and that is the human condition. And in between, people simply labor. What is interesting, because it is not mentioned here, is a more explicit punishment on human beings. The ground itself is cursed. The serpent is cursed away from being a part of the other collegial animal family. But humans are not cursed. And that's an important thing to notice. God does not punish them in that way. In a way, what God does lay out for the punishment of humans is much more tragic than simple destruction, or God starting over with the giraffe, which was the puzzle that I asked you to think about over the weekend. Why, at this point in the narrative, does God just not say, well, that was a bad idea, and let's go do something else now and see if we can't get something more, or a friendly Cocker Spaniel or something like that? Wouldn't that have been a better choice? You're beginning to understand something now about the way in which the Yahwist conceives of the relationship between God and humans. And if you stop to think of the questions that God or that the Yahwist does not take up in the narrative, why did God do things the way God did? Why did God put people in the garden and allow them the possibility of transgressing the divine command? Later on, theologians will agonize about this question endlessly. The Yahwist is not interested. Similarly here, why doesn't God simply wipe out these people and start over again? Now, this will eventually occur to God, but not right now in the narrative. God seems to want to try over again with these same people. So you're beginning to build up a picture of the notion of the deity in the Yahwist. And it seems to be a deity who has what later theologians will call free will. That is, people that the deity creates are free to do what they want, including violating commands from the deity. God made them that way, and it makes a certain amount of logical sense then not to punish them terminally for exercising that free will. And that's going to come out over and over again in this Yahwist narrative. At every point where things seem to be going badly, God takes another step in the direction of trying to recreate the relationship as it should be between the people and the deity. You see a small example of this after getting us to life as we now know it, and all of the problems. And notice that the giving of names symbolizes and locks into place the gender-linked characteristics of the people. They are now to be known, not in and of themselves, but by what they do. Adam is a creature of the ground who works the ground, even though it does not yield good results for him. He has nothing else that he can do. And Eve is linked forever to painful childbearing. And the names are explained by the Yahwist with those two references. She was called Eve because she was the mother of all living. He is called Adam because he is the earth creature. He is the one who is connected to the ground and is doomed to work it forever. So these characteristics that we think of as part of the human condition, according to the Yahwists, didn't necessarily need to be that way. But that is the way things finally turned out. And what does God do now? God simply gives in to the weakness of these two creatures. It's very subtle, and you might miss it in verse 21, but there it is. And so the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. They were worried by their differences, which became apparent when they realized they were naked, when they knew suddenly about difference. And now God masks that for them by providing for them. God takes one more step in the direction of trying to have a harmonious creation. But they cannot any longer live in the garden. The garden was a place where all things got along with each other. And God now recognizes that wherever people live, it cannot be the garden. That they tried that and were incapable of living in the garden. So the garden becomes, in biblical thought, thanks to the way the Yahwist portrays it, the garden becomes a place where people tried to live but were unable to live, and they then were expelled from the garden, and because they could not live by the rules of the garden, and it is a place to which they will never return. It's always out there somewhere, and it's no great accident that when they begin to contemplate the end time, what we call theologically eschatology, the end time will have them returning to the garden, coming around in the same kind of full circle that we've already seen in what happens in human life. But now they will go back to the beginning and be able to live there. But that's not on the horizon of the Yahwist. That will come later on as people look back at the Yahwist story of the garden with longing and with a good bit of regret. And so the Lord God said, "The humans have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now lest they should go and touch the tree of life and take that and eat and live forever, we've got to get them out of here." So they expelled them. The Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, or the people, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim, these serpent-like guardian figures. We'll meet them later on in the story. And a flaming sword, which turned every which way to guard, or whirled is a better translation, to guard the way to the tree of life. That's a place now to which they will not return. Having done that, though, we are now with people in a land that closely resembles our land and living a life that is the life that we all recognize as the human life. Like it or not, that's what has now happened. Things are, if possible, about to get worse. Just when you think the Yahwist is through with you, here come some more stories. Now Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, "I have begotten a human with the help of Yahweh." Exactly what she understands by that is not really clear. It is a pun in Hebrew, much beloved. We've talked about the love of wordplay in the Yahwist. So she says kaniti, which means I have gotten or purchased or begotten. It can mean all of those things, but it means to acquire. A human being, and kaniti is obviously a pun on Cain, which means something else. So there's a play on the name, and we'll see a lot of these birth stories in the Yahweh's narrative, all the way up through the bearing of the sons of Jacob. We'll see a lot of these birth stories that are really stories that do word plays on how the child is going to be named. And so the Yahweh just says the people started doing this early on. And then again, she bore his brother Abel. Now these people are engaged in life as we know it. Abel, we are told, was a sheep keeper, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, stories about shepherds and farmers are all over the ancient Near East. We have all sorts of these kinds of examples of conflicts. It's something like the conflicts that existed out in the western part of our country when it was developing between the farmers and the cattle keepers, who were always at each other's throats. The cattle keepers wanted rangeland, the farmers wanted tilled ground, and the two of them kept getting in each other's way. So these sorts of stories about conflicts between sheep keepers on the one hand and people who grow crops on the other hand are endemic to the ancient Near East. These were the two main forms of activity to keep civilization going, and they are in conflict with each other because the sheep are going to eat the crops that the tiller of the ground does, and the tiller of the ground wants to get rid of the sheep keepers, therefore. The Israelites were sheep keepers originally, and therefore in this story it's going to be the sheep keeper who is the hero of the story, if that's right. I mean, if that's the right word to describe what happens with Abel, because he winds up dead, which is not a good result. The farmer is the one where in Mesopotamia most of the people were farmers, and when this story is told over in Mesopotamia, the hero of the story is always the farmer. So you have two cultures who have different economies and they tell the story differently, but the story itself is an old story that survives in this country in sort of plebeian ways, like the conflicts between people from New York and people from New Jersey, for example, or people from Texas and people from Oklahoma. These sorts of stories are common in a lot of different cultures. So that's the base of this story. What happens to it in the hands of the Yahwist is that it gets turned in a kind of theological direction. So Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord liked the offering of Abel, but had no regard for the offering of Cain. Well, that makes sense. God apparently prefers meat to vegetables. And we won't get into the argument how that all works out with the vegetarian movement and all of that. But that's the way the story is going to be told. So notice that the Yahwist again doesn't explain why God has this kind of preference or why he doesn't like the offering of Cain. That's not the way the story goes. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted?" Well, Cain thought he had done well. He brought the offerings that he got from the fruit that he had grown and brought it to the deity. That's what he's supposed to do. So why is the deity not accepting of the offering? Cain is puzzled. And God just rubs it in. If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door like an animal ready to pounce. So watch where you go and what you do. It desires you, but you must master it. Cain does not get the message. Cain said to Abel, his brother, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. We have moved now from two people who don't get along with each other to the first ultimate example of people who don't get along with each other. The first murder that is created in an effort to please the deity. Notice now that the conversations work in the same disconnected way that they worked in the conversation between Adam and Eve earlier in the garden story. And the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" Now, that question has a very simple answer. Well, actually, Abel is dead over there in the field. That's the answer to that question, which God perfectly well knows. That's not, however, what Cain says to Yahweh. He says, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" There have been more bad sermons preached on that line, probably, than there is time, because at this point we cannot resist in the story starting a homily. And the homily begins, "Of course we are our brother's keeper," and on it will go in that vein. Cain is saying something rather more insidious, which is in thorough harmony with the way in which these people have reacted previously when confronted by the deity over something. They try to displace blame. They are so subtle about it that only the deity in the story gets it. Most readers don't get it. But here it is. Nowhere in the Old Testament are people commanded to keep another individual. That's not one of the human tasks. You love other people, you take care of other people, you welcome other people. Nowhere are you supposed to keep people. And there could be an interesting psychological exploration of that fact, given what has happened with some of this material. But you are not to keep another person. On the other hand, you already know, although you probably have forgotten, that God is persistently described as the one who keeps people. Think of the common benediction, the so-called Levitical benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Or the psalmist saying that God is the keeper of Israel who does not slumber or sleep, unlike the shepherd who is the keeper of the sheep. So people keep animals. God keeps humans. So Cain's response to God is in fact an accusation which is trying desperately to misplace blame. I'm not responsible for my brother, he says to God. You are responsible for my brother. And if you don't know where he is, then it's none of my business. So it really is a very subtle and angry kind of reply that Cain makes to the deity. God, of course, knows exactly where Abel is and immediately says, in continuing the conversation, Yahweh said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed away from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." So, having defiled the ground in this act of murder, Cain is now separated from it. Cain, the farmer, whose job it is to till the ground, now is separated from the ground, and therefore has no livelihood, no way of continuing in this particular structure of economy. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. Not only that, you will be away from the ground in another way. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Notice Cain's reaction. We have now a specific reaction. Cain said to Yahweh, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. You've driven me this day away from the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will slay me. I will be a permanent alien from people and from the deity," is the complaint. Whoever finds me will slay me. Then the Lord said to him, "No. If anyone slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold." And so God put a mark on Cain, lest any who came upon him should kill him. And then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, which is simply another one of the puns. Nod, Nud, means wandering in Hebrew. So he becomes a permanent alien. He has no place to live. He doesn't settle into a city the way other people will. And in fact, we'll see in a minute, cities have not even been invented yet. He's simply wandering around in the outback somewhere. Now, notice the reaction again of the deity. Just as the deity sort of swallowed hard and worked with Adam and Eve after their transgression, so also the deity is said to do the same thing with Cain. So Cain has done the ultimate violation of the human order, but God nevertheless will not kill Cain and will not let anybody else kill Cain either. So when the people complain that the punishment is too great, God responds positively to that complaint. So you're beginning to build up the picture of this back and forth that goes on between the deity and the people in the way that the Yahwist is thinking about this. Now Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and she bore Enoch. And he built a city. So we're now going to look at the children of Cain and his wife. This is the so-called Cainite genealogy. And it's terribly important because what it's doing is tracing the origin of all of those things that we associate with civilization. So Cain knew his wife, and the first child who is born is said to be a city builder. And with the building of cities, life begins to look very much like a normal place again. So it will be the city which is the place of refuge for aliens, and it will be the city where people ultimately are meant to live. It will be the city where people are able to practice the arts of civilization, and those are now about to be created. So far we've had the creation, if you start counting, we've had the creation of agriculture, we've had the creation of sheep keeping, we've had the creation of wanderers and murderers. We've have all of these come together now in human civilization around the city. Enoch was born to Irad, and Irad was the father of Mahujael, and Mahujael was the father of Metushael, and Metushael was the father of Lamech. And so Lamech had two wives, and this is an old piece of poetry which the Yahwist has embedded in the storyline. Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the other was Zillah. And Adah bore Yavel, and he was the ancestor of all those who dwell in tents and have cattle. So he is the ancestor of all these transhuman pastoralists that are wandering around in the Levant To this day, if you go over to Israel, you'll see the Bedouin over there in their tent villages, moving around with the flocks and so on. So this is another piece of civilization. He was the ancestor of all those who dwell in tents and have cattle. His brother's name was Yuval, and he was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and the harp. So here come the musicians. That's also a piece of the origins of civilization. So it's civilization, as the Yahwist knows it, is a mixed bag. You've got all these different kinds of people doing different kinds of things together in one location. And Zilha bore Tubal-Cain, and he was a forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. So we get the first metal worker, the first artisan created. This is another pun on his name and Cain. We won't go into all the details of that. And he had a sister whose name was Naamah. So Lamech said to his wife, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have slain a man for wounding me, even a young man for striking me. Cain is of age sevenfold, and Lamech 77-fold. Retribution originally was in the hands of the deity. With the creation of civilization, retribution is now in human hands, and it is unbalanced. So we have what is a thoroughly inappropriate punishment linked to a crime which is minimal. So with the creation of civilization goes the possibility of the perversion of justice, and by implication, the perversion of rule, when people take the running of civilization into their own hands. All right, the Yahwist narrative now picks up again in chapter 6. So we're just tracking the Yahwist today. We'll get to the priestly writer on Wednesday. So when humans began, now notice that we're getting a kind of progression here. I mean, we've started with the disobedience of the first pair. We've moved to the first murder. We've now moved to the creation of civilization with all of its pluses and minuses. And now we are going to move in another direction. The tendency of humans to disobey, not to do what the deity wants, is now in chapter 6 going to spread to the divine world. What they do is it's not just enough to corrupt this world. They are also going to corrupt the divine world. That is to say, the deity is corrupted in a way by what the people do, according to the Yahwist. So when people began to multiply on the face of the ground, this is chapter 6, beginning. And daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair. So you have these divine beings that suddenly begin to look into what's going on the earth. And what they finally do, they are not supposed to do. It's the mixing of the heavenly and the earthly, which the Yahwist takes to be an illegitimate kind of mixing, and so does Yahweh. They took to wife such of them as they chose, and God said, My spirit shall not abide in humans forever. He is flesh, and his days will be 120 years. You can't live longer than 120 years. So we're getting down in the general direction of a human lifespan. The priestly writer will tell this story rather differently. But at least for the Yahwist, he's still operating in the level of possibility, theoretically. Now, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Now, you remember what the Nephilim are. The Nephilim are sort of super race of warriors who are best explained, the Yahwist thinks, by saying that they are the result of an illegitimate mating between divinities and people. And as the Israelites get closer and closer to the land, they're going to get more and more of these Nephilim-like characters inhabiting the land. And that's going to lead them, by the time we get to Numbers, in a story that we will investigate at great length when we're doing the exegesis workshop. When the people go to spy out the land, they will find there remnants of the Nephilim running around. And they say, this is a really bad place. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And so they turn down this land that they have been wandering around in the wilderness waiting to get to. And God is really upset about that. So the Nephilim are going to make a reappearance a bit later on. So the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, they bore children to them, and they were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Notice now what God concludes. Things have gotten out of hand. They have spread to the divine realm and are not simply confined to the human realm. God seems to think it's all right for people to muck up the human realm, but mucking up the divine realm is something else. So God saw that the wickedness of humans was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God finally concludes, after all of this story that the Yahwist has been telling you, that people are simply innately evil. There is something in the human condition that causes them to do this. And therefore, God concludes, the only solution to this problem is to get rid of them. So what we expected at the end of chapter 2, and we expected it to happen in chapter 3, didn't. But now in chapter 6, the Yahweh says God is contemplating wiping out the entire creation. So the Lord said, I will blot out the humans whom I have created from the face of the ground, man and animal, creeping thing, birds of the air. I am sorry I made them. But God miscalculates. God liked Noah. We have no idea why God liked Noah, but that's a fatal flaw in the plan. And you'll see why in a minute. I'm not going to separate these lines from you in the flood narrative. I'll let you do that on your own. And what you're going to see, however, is the story of the ark and the building of the boat and the salvation of the animals and the people. And so if God is going to wipe out, think about it, if God is going to wipe out all of the people, but allow two people and their kids to survive, what do you think is going to happen after the flood? It's going to be a total failure for fixing this problem, right? Because as long as people, if there is something innately wrong with people, then that's going to continue after the flood, as long as there are people around. And sure enough, at the end of the long flood story, which you will be going through later on in the week, verse 20 of chapter 9. Now Noah was the first tiller of the soil. So Noah and his family have survived. He and the kids have all survived, along with the animals. And he planted a vineyard, and he drank the wine, and he became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. And then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father, and so on. And they did not see their father's nakedness. This is a very puzzling story. In antiquity, they have no idea what to do with this. They have all sorts of ideas, very creative ideas, and modern scholars have done the same. There are whole books on this narrative. I won't go into all of the detail, but what I think is going on here is that we have an example of the first act of incest. That is to say, having sex with a near relative. That idiom, to uncover the nakedness of X, is usually to have sex with X's spouse. And so that is probably somehow what is going on in this story. It's a major sexual violation as well as a social violation. People, in most cultures, people have an anti-incest rule or custom. They don't have sex within the near family, which genetically is a good thing, but that's not the reason they don't do it. It's a purely social norm. And that's probably what's going on here, which is the puzzling explanation, or puzzling thing that happens in the story, is that the three kids who are involved in this narrative are not the ones who are cursed. The one who is cursed is Canaan, who is a son of Ham. This is often, incidentally, in the days of slavery, the narrative that was used to talk about the curse on Ham, which was viewed mainly in that era of the 18th, 17th century as the Africans. If you look at the Table of Nations, we'll see that that portion of the world is said to have descended from Ham. But Ham is never cursed in the story. One of his sons is cursed, namely Canaan, and you can guess at why that happened. But in the narrative then, it is probably the child who is born from this incestuous relationship who is cursed. And by the way, it also curses our enemies, the Canaanites, who are not African at all. They are from the Levant the same way the Semites are. So there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in the story. However you read it, it ain't good. It is something that should not be happening in this creation, and it's an indication that this flood plan did not work, that people are still evil, that God has done nothing to fix that problem, and now they're spreading, and chapter 10 has the narrative about the spreading of all of the people. And finally, we get the story in chapter 11 of the tower, in which the people want to build a defensive tower. That's what the word means, so that they will be safe from everyone, and their city will be protected. Now, this is supposed to have a Mesopotamian background to it, and indeed there is a story of Mesopotamian. The Mesopotamian mixture of language story. But it really probably has nothing to do with the ziggurat. That began when people in the West discovered the first ziggurat or temple tower and began publishing pictures of it. And it was that caused people to think that that's what this is about. But the story really is about the creation of a defensive tower and the isolationism of cities and the potential for warfare between cities, which can arise once everybody begins building a bigger tower. So very analogous to the arms race. Build a bigger bomb and it will somehow make things better. And that is probably the kind of story that we're dealing with here in chapter 11. Whatever it is, it's simply another example for the Yahwist of how things are not going well in the world. And God tries to slow it down by creating different languages so that the people are not able to communicate effectively with each other, and they won't be able to defend themselves against an attack from the heavens. So that's what's going to happen. But at best, that's only a stopgap. God apparently at this point, in a way, gives up and says, all right, I've got all these people now. I don't know what to do with them. They're getting out of hand. Their potential for doing major damage is great. What should I do? God sensibly decides, well, if I couldn't do it with the human race as a whole, maybe I ought to try smaller. a smaller group. And so God tries a single individual. And that single individual is going to be Abraham. So the Yahweh story continues into the section on the ancestors. And in chapter 12 we get, so Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country, your kindred, your ancestral home, to the land that I will show you. And here you need to translate the Hebrew as it is, syntactically, so that I may make of you a great nation. The making of a great nation is contingent on obedience. It's contingent on the going. Now, we've seen God making commands of this sort throughout the narrative, and the human reaction to them normally is to simply ignore them or violate them. And so it comes as a great relief, I'm sure, to the deity when the narrative continues. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And by you, all of the families of the earth will bless themselves. That is to say, may you be like Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham went as Yahweh told him. This is the first time somebody has responded positively in the Yahweh's narrative. And you've got to see great relief on the part of the deity. Maybe this is going to work. Now we'll stop the Yahweh's narrative at that point and go back and pick up the way the priestly writer sets this material by framing it. But you should keep in mind that when we begin then to read the ancestral narratives and stories about Abraham and the kids, Jacob and Isaac, things are not as good as, Abraham may be obedient, but he's dumb. And he's going to do all sorts of things that are not going to fit in with the narrative. So next time we'll go back and pick up the priestly writer's version of all of this and how he differs in a major way from the Yahwist.